Hi guys, I wanted to share with you my tarot and oracle deck collection. It is something that I've been wanting to do for some time, and I recently found myself having to isolate due to COVID, and that's when I decided that I would really try and collate the collection that I have and make some sense out of it. It is one that has organically grown over the years, with different decks being added and others being removed, and there are decks within my collection that I use consistently, and then there are others that kind of get pushed to the wayside and not as much airplay as they probably should. So I decided that I would create an Excel spreadsheet that would help me understand my current collection and how many decks I have and how I use them, and hopefully be a way for me to really understand where I'm at in my journey today. So one of the reasons why I use tarot and oracle decks mainly is for my spiritual practice. It's something that I've always had in my life. My mother used to use them when I was very young, and it's something that's very natural and always been there for me in my experience. But one of the things that I have found is that over the years, the number of decks available has grown immensely. The ability to purchase them has just exploded, and they're readily available in, you know, your local stores, like in Australia, Kmart and Target and those kind of places, as well as your metaphysical stores that you would have normally gone to. So we're seeing a huge influx of different cards. We're seeing a huge influx of new creators creating their own, and we're also seeing an explosion of the everyday person utilizing tarot and oracle decks in their everyday life. So what I've done is I've created an Excel spreadsheet, and it took me over 18 hours to create, which meant that it was roughly about 6.5 minutes for every deck that I have. So in a minute I'll tell you how many decks I have in my collection, and I hope you guys find this interesting. I know that when I was collating it and putting it together, I thought it would give me certain information, which it certainly does, but it also gives me information that I never even dreamed of, and I'm really excited about having. So the first page of the Excel spreadsheet that I have here, it details all of the decks that I have. It's the basic information on the decks. I have the creator and the artist, if they're known. I have the number of cards within a deck. I have whether it or not it has a guidebook, the year of publication, who the actual publisher is, and what kind of box it has. Now, I know that may sound a little bit silly, but I love knowing what kind of box something comes in, and the number of copies that I have, and whether the copies are sealed or not. I do have a couple of decks that are still sealed because I haven't opened them, but I'm sure in time that they will definitely be open. So one of the things I learned when I was putting all this information together is that within my collection, I actually have 158 different decks. Now, I was blown away by that number. Last time I counted my decks, I probably had about 30, and that's something that I always kept a handle on. But as I said, with the readily available accessibility of decks, that has grown immensely. So when I actually started to collate this and I finished and realized that I have 158 different decks, that really surprised me. I knew my collection had grown, but I didn't think it had grown that much. But one of the interesting things that I found is that I actually have 171 decks in my collection. So there's 158 different ones, but 171. So obviously that means that I have some decks multiple copies of. Now, some of the reasons why I have multiple copies of decks is because when I've gone out, a deck has called to me and I've purchased it again. On the odd occasion, it's a deck that I've had for a really long time and I haven't used for a while, so I'd forgotten that I had it. On other occasions, I've known that I've had the deck, but the energy that was coming from the second copy of the deck was really drawing me in, so I decided to buy it. And I found that even though they are the same name, the same cards, identical, that they actually have different energies. So I actually have 11 decks twice in my collection, and they are all open and being used, and I actually have one deck 3 times. So I thought that that was an interesting anomaly, and I know that I do use the different decks at different points, and I use all of them. So the next thing that I found quite interesting is I decided to look at the cards within the deck. That's something that, you know, we're all interested in, I imagine. So I was looking at things like the card size, the number of cards actually within the deck, the shape, the coloring, the thickness, whether they're gloss or matte, whether they've got words on them, whether they're heavily detailed in imagery, and whether they're numbered, and whether they have gilded edges or not, and how easy they are to shuffle. So some of the things that I found out is that I actually have very few decks that have minimal imagery on the cards. So that kind of surprised me. I do like working with decks that are quite minimal, but most of my decks have a lot of detailed imagery, which I found really interesting. The other thing that I found is that the majority of my decks have a title and a message written on them, or a keyword. There is only a few that have a title, and there was, I think, only two decks that didn't have any writing on them at all, and I do love using those decks. So as you can see when I scroll down here, one of the things that blew me away is I realized when I collated all of the decks together that I have access to 8,208 cards within my collection. So that's all the cards within all of the decks, and that number really blew me away. To me, that's huge. I didn't really think about that number. It's nothing that I've ever really considered. I pick up a deck, it might have 36 cards, it might have 44, it might have 63, it might have 78. But when you collectively put them together, I've got 8,208 cards that I can draw upon for my spiritual practices. And this to me is absolutely phenomenal, because I don't necessarily use one particular deck when I'm doing a reading. I might use cards from multiple decks. I mix and match them. So this opens up a huge array of opportunities for me to be able to seek guidance and be able to understand my own journey. The next one that I have along my Excel spreadsheet is I wanted to learn about the guidebooks that I have. So not all of the decks that I have guidebooks. Some of them just have little leaflets, but the majority of them do have guidebooks. And it was quite interesting to see how many of them were black and white and how many of them were color. And the other interesting thing was number of decks had images of the cards within the guidebook, and which number of decks didn't have images of the cards in the guidebook. But the one thing that really surprised me is that on the whole, when looking at the guidebook, the reverse meaning column that I have, that most of my decks do not have a reverse meaning. So when you pull a card, it doesn't have a reverse meaning, which also means that when you, on the cards, the backs are often not reversible because they don't need to be. The cards are only read in an upright position. So it was interesting to see the different sizes in the books, the guidebooks that I have. Some of them are very tiny and slim, and the writing inside it is really tiny, and I have to really concentrate to read, where others were great big books which made it easier for me to be able to read and delve into them. Most of the guidebooks have a detailed message. There are some in my collection, such as my Doreen Virtue decks, that have a very standard message, but there are a lot of decks, especially the newer decks, that have really detailed messages in the guidebook, which means that they're often very layered, and you can peel back the different layers and the different aspects to be able to build the meaning within the messages that you're receiving, which I absolutely love. Another interesting anomaly for me was that when I looked at all the guidebooks collectively, I was able to see that there was 14,390 pages. I'll just say that again, 14,390 pages of information that these creators have put together to be able to serve up to us so that we can use their product. So things like spreads that you can use with your readings, things like how you actually use the cards, the card meanings themselves. All that information was contained within those pages, and I found that really interesting to be able to step outside of the normal way of thinking, that when you're using a deck, you have a guidebook and that guidebook is meant for those cards. Absolutely, it's meant for those cards, but I have a lot of decks that have similar card meanings, and by being able to pull a guidebook from a different deck that has a similar card meaning, I was able to then just expand the messages that were being given, and it was just another tool that I could use to be able to really dig deep and pull out messages from the cards that I get when I do my readings. So the next thing I have in here is a tab on deck energy. This is one that I find interesting for myself, and one that I really do fall back on quite a lot. So when I get a new deck, I actually will hold the deck and I will close my eyes and I will ask the deck to give me a emotion or a sense of feeling or 3 or 4 words of what it would like to give me in relation to the energy that that deck has and can provide for me. So when I get the deck, I do that and I document whatever comes to me, so that that's a springboard for me to work from as I begin to build a relationship with the deck on what kind of energy it wishes to bring to our relationship. And then obviously as I work with the deck and we become more familiar with each other and our energies begin to work together, the energy of the deck will shift. It's just, for me, it's just like any relationship you might have with a person, that the more you interact and the more you get to know each other, the more the energy changes and shifts and becomes a combined energy. So in this particular part of my spreadsheet, I write the deck energy that's given to me when I initially get the deck, and then as it changes over time, I will update that with the information so that I always understand how that deck works for me. So the next one I have is thoughts and concerns. So when I'm working with a deck, sometimes there may be concerns that I have or thoughts that I think are really relevant. If I feel a deck is too positive, I will put it in here. If I think it's too fluffy or too gimmicky, I will put it in here. If it's a deck that I think I could really do with a second copy because I don't want to be in a situation where something has happened to it and I've no longer got the ability to use the deck or access the deck, I put in there that I need a second copy. If a deck doesn't resonate with me, I will put it in there and I will put in why. They're the kind of things that I tend to put in here. And if I feel that a deck is outdated, I will also put that in here too. Or if I think it's a really great deck for growth. So that's where I document all those kind of things. So the next one I find quite interesting is the deck uses. So within my collection, because I have so many decks, I have them because I don't just use them for readings. So with the 158 different decks, some of them I will use for readings, some of them I will use for journaling, some of them I like to use as a card to place on my altar, some of them I like to use when I'm contemplating. I use them with my energy work when I want to know the energy of the day or a situation, or if I'm working with somebody with I'm a Reiki master, if I'm working with somebody with my healing energy, I will draw cards to assist with that. And when I'm doing my own shadow work, which is a huge part of my own personal journey. So what I did is I wrote a number of columns, and they are journaling, time pour, devotional practice, which is my daily practice, readings, contemplation, meditation, altar, shadow work, energy work, and every day. One of the things that I found really interesting was that I have 158 decks, different decks, as I said, in the collection. But there's only 92 of them that I would actually use for journaling. So if I wish to know an answer to a question or something and I want to journal about that, then there's 92 decks that I would call upon. And it's interesting to note that I also do contemplation. Now, for me, the difference between journaling is I actually document it, I write it down, or draw it, whatever I wish to do at the time, or a combination of both. Whereas contemplation is when, for me personally, is all in my head. So I will use a card or cards and I will just think about it in my head and work my way through it that way. So there's 73 decks that I would use for contemplation, but there's 92 decks that I would use for journaling. And they're not necessarily the same decks, which I found quite interesting. The other thing I found interesting is that out of my 158 different decks, there's only 118 of them that I use for readings. So that means I've got a number of decks that I do not read with. I purely use them for my energy work or my meditations or my journaling and that kind of thing, which I found really, really interesting. So I have 97 decks that I've identified that I would use every day. So it wouldn't matter what I was doing. I could quite easily pull them any day of the week and use them. But in saying that, I only have 48 that I use for my daily practices. So obviously the difference is ones that I could pull out every day to do readings. But if I was doing a daily practice devotional kind of work with my cards, then there would only be 48 decks that I would generally call upon. So I have 92 decks that I predominantly use for my altar. So depending on what time of what time and space we are in the wheel of the year, depending on what situation I'm in, depending on the seasons, all those kind of things. Depends on what deck I might potentially use to be placed on my altar. So I found that quite interesting that there was 90 of them. When I work with my decks, I also like to do shadow work. So when I'm doing shadow work, I find that I had 22 decks in my collection for shadow work. So what I found really interesting about that is, I mean, for me, any deck can be used for shadow work. It's not about whether it's a dark deck or a light deck or a combination of each. You can choose any deck for shadow deck. It's how they work for you so that you're able to get the best out of it. So the way I do shadow work, I find that I have a number of decks that really make me go deep and kind of tug at the heartstrings and have a real deep, in-depth kind of feel to them. And they draw me in and make me look at the aspects of myself that I would rather remain hidden. So there are 22 decks that I currently use for that. I also have some decks that I use for specific readings, such as the Lover's Tarot, which I only use for relationship and love readings. I have decks that I use for my moon work, and I have decks that I use with children. So the next tab that I have that I created was the deck level. Now it's interesting to note, I noticed that when people are looking at getting involved in tarot and oracle cards and they're very new to it, they'll go, oh, is this a beginner deck? Let me know what a beginner deck is. Now, if any of you have watched some of my earlier videos, you may have noticed that I've actually asked you, regardless of where you are on your journey, that when you're going to buy a new deck, you think about what kind of reader are you? And I talk about the differences within a visual reader and a guided reader and a intuitive reader, and whether you're a word reader. So what I have done is I've created this spreadsheet for myself so that it does document which decks I think are good for beginners, intermediate and advanced, and for kids, and whether I think it's good for a visual reader, an intuitive reader, a word reader, or a guided reader. So even though if somebody came to me and said, I'm all new to this, what beginning decks would you suggest would be great for my practice and to start with, I would actually be asking them like some kind of questions. What do you want the deck for? What are you looking to gain from the deck? What kind of experience do you want? How do you want to interact with the cards? And I'd be looking at those things, whether they're visual, intuitive, word, or guided readers more so, and then looking at which decks would work for them. So in saying that, I found that out of the 158 decks that I have, there would be 132 decks which I would suggest are good for beginners. Now, for beginners, I mean that they either have a really great guidebook, they're either visually strong in their symbology, or their wording so that you could easily pick up the messages that they have. I have 59 of them I think are really strong for visual learners. Visual readers, so that if you are reading from the imagery and everything, there's 59 decks that I think would really suit that kind of reader. If you're an intuitive reader, now intuitive, you can read any deck. So for me, I've looked at how I use my intuition and how I think that falls into being an intuitive reader, and it is subjective. It is only my opinion, and I know that there will be millions out there that will disagree with me, and there'll probably be some people that do agree with me. So I'm very mindful of the fact that it is just my opinion. But out of my 158 decks, I have 103 I think are really great for intuitive readers. I have 59 decks that I think would be great for people who are word readers, so people who rely heavily on the words that are on a card to be able to work out their messages. And I have 106 decks that I think out of the 158 different ones that I think are really great for guided readers. So when I think of a guided reader, it's somebody who can get the messages visually, intuitively, or through the words to be able to understand what it means, but they really want to be guided. So they need to have a really great guidebook that can actually support and back up the messages that they're getting, so that they can get their own messages and then read the guidebook and go, yep, I was on the right track. So there's 106 different different decks for that. The next one I did is I wanted to know what kind of decks that I have. So in my collection, I have oracle decks, I have tarot decks, I have affirmation decks, I have health and wellness decks, I have inspiration decks, I have mindfulness decks and wisdom decks. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to know how many of each category that I have. Now, regardless of what kind of deck they are, I use them all in exactly the same way. I use them in my daily practices, I use them in my readings, I use them in my journaling, my meditation. So regardless of what the pack says, whether it's an oracle or a tarot or a wisdom deck, I use them all in the same way. So for me, they're all in the one bucket and they're all in the one collection. So some of the things that I did learn is that within my collection, I actually have 18 decks that are currently out of print. They vary in what they are, but there's 18 of them. I have 109 oracle decks and 24 tarot decks. So with my oracle decks, I absolutely love them. I love the variety that they provide, and I love the difference in opinion and energy that they bring to a reading, and I find them really exciting. I only have 24 tarot decks. Now, that's not because I don't find tarot decks exciting. That's because I find that the tarot decks I have are a great foundation and work for me, that I don't need any other decks at all. They give me everything that I need when I'm doing readings, so I don't feel that I need to go out and buy a new tarot deck or something different to be able to work with. I have 4 decks that are affirmation decks. I have 3 decks that are wisdom or mindfulness decks. I have 4 Kickstarter decks in my collection, and I actually love Kickstarter decks. They are something that I found a little while ago and I've watched very carefully. There are a number of them that I'm still waiting for delivery of, and I'm really looking forward to getting them. They are more expensive, especially living in Australia. It's far more expensive to be able to back a oracle or tarot deck on Kickstarter and have it posted to you. The postage is exorbitant. But there are some decks that I think are really well worth the time and the energy and the money to be able to get them here for me. So I'm really looking forward to having them join my collection when they arrive and being able to share them with you. Now, the last page that I have, actually it's not the last page, it's the second last page, but the next page that I have is other information. So this is where I have information in regards to all of the decks that I have. It's information that's not specific to the deck itself, but things I like to remember. So there are a number of decks in here that I was gifted from my mum, so I like to have that there so I remember that they were my mum's cards originally. If I find a deck to be really accurate and insightful, I love to put that in here. I like to know if there's any printing errors in my deck, I put it in here. If there's any extras in my deck, some of my decks have multiple of one card, some of mine have multiple of the same guidebook in them, so I like to have that kind of information here. If there's any damage or anything on my decks, I like to document it here. And as I said in the beginning, this is the information that I like to know about my collection. It may not be something you would like to know if you were ever going to collate information about your own, but I find it valuable for me. So the last one that I have is one that I'm looking forward to being able to build over the next 6 months. So I decided that what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to track my usage of my decks and how I use them in my practice over the next 6 months. But from July to December 2022, what I intend to do is to document the decks that I use and the reason why I'm using them. And the reason I want to do that is I want to be able to see what percentage of my decks I'm using, what kind of practices I'm doing consistently, so that I can look at where I'm at and where I might be headed. So if I find that there are a number of decks that I just don't get to, I might be able to look at them and go, okay, what is it about these decks? How can I bring them into my practice and make them valuable and really part of my experience? Or should I be looking at potentially rehoming them to somebody else who could use them for their own spiritual practices and in their daily practices? Because what I don't want is I don't want stagnant energy around my decks. I don't want them to sit here just because they're pretty or because they add numbers to my collection. I really want them to be valued and I want them to be appreciated, and that means I want them to be used. I really want to have a really wholesome, continuous experience with them. That doesn't mean I need to use them every day. But what it does mean is that I need to have a path forward that is continuously building upon the relationship that we have. And it's not one of those where the deck just sits there. So for me, this particular page is about identifying whether there's a season, a reason, or a lifetime behind a deck. And I'm quite happy that if there's a season and that season is over with that deck, to be able to release it and allow it to go out into the universe and be able to be there for someone else. If there's a reason and the reason has now passed, I'm also happy to be able to thank the deck for everything that it's provided and to be able to move it on, continue its journey with somebody else rather than keep it hostage to me and my journey and tucked away and not used. Or if something's a lifetime, I'm really happy to be able to identify which decks in my collection are currently lifetime decks and decks that I continuously turn to and the greatest relationships that I have. So this is a fantastic way for me to be able to identify that and to be able to streamline the collection that I have so that it really works for my benefit and the benefit of the decks that I have. Because I really do appreciate them and I want to be able to do the right thing by them. And if that means that my journey's over with them, then that's okay with me. So there you have it, guys. That's my deck collection in an Excel spreadsheet. I did want to, and I do want to, and I will show you all of the decks that I have. But what I struggled with is working out how best to do that. So I've been considering whether I should show you all my Oracle decks and all my Tarot decks, or whether I should show you the decks by whether they're good for beginners, or whether I think they're good for intermediate people, or whether it would just be best to show them whether they're angel decks or whether they're goddess decks or whether they're nature decks. That's where I'm struggling with. If you've managed to make it this far and you'd like to have some input on how I may deliver them, I'd really be interested to know. So really looking forward to that. As I said at the beginning, one of the reasons of doing this Excel spreadsheet is to be able to make sure that my deck collection is living, breathing and growing, and that it has the ability to thrive and be seen and heard. So by knowing what I've got and how it works for me, I believe that that does that. Some of the things that I didn't put in here at the beginning, now when I look back on, I wish I had have, and I will go back and do at some stage, is I wish I had have had a column somewhere for diversity. I also would love to know which themes my decks fall under. I imagine that'll be something that I will do in the near future. This is a living, breathing document for me. It's going to be forever changing. It's never going to stay the same. It's going to have decks removed. It's going to have decks added. It's going to have the energies of the decks changed. It's going to have all this stuff happening. It will take me time. It did take me 18 hours to get it to the state that it's in now. But I really think that the information that I have gained from this is absolutely incredible, and it has been soul enhancing for me personally. So I hope you've enjoyed it, guys. Really look forward to sharing more of my deck collection with you in the future. Take care. Bye.